Just like narcissistic people aren't going to change, narcissistic belief systems, organizations, and cultures also aren't going to change. And it means that people within a society who have been harmed in these relationships really have no choice but to draw together and validate each other and recognize that life isn't always pretty and it's not your damn job to keep other people's fairy tales alive by shutting your mouth and taking the blame. The emotional and psychological harm that takes place in narcissistic relationships is real. I have watched it my entire life and studied it for a goodly chunk of it. It's real.
There's something shocking that's decreasing people's lifespan that most people actually don't know about, and it has a lot to do with the toxic people in their lives. We know the longest study on happiness ever conducted by...
Shut the fuck up. Oh my god.
Going.
Well, for more on this, I'd like to bring in Ritesh Kotak. He is a cybersecurity and tech analyst, and we've reached him in Toronto. Making the time, how are Microsoft and CrowdStrike connected?
So the way they're connected is with the Microsoft servers. So when we think of the cloud, we think about this thing in the sky, but in reality, the data and the systems are very physical. They're located in multiple locations around the world, and it's kind of the brains that kind of powers the internet. And what they're using is they themselves have to be protected, and they use different pieces of software to protect their what are called their endpoints and to protect their servers. Now, one of them is CrowdStrike, and if CrowdStrike causes the blue screen of death on computers, it does something very similar to these servers, thus impacting these operations by turning them completely off or putting them in a loop, or we don't know exactly how they impacted, but at the end of the day, the servers were shut down. Now, when the servers shut down, all the applications that are built on top of the server, such as airline check-in systems, are impacted as well, thus shutting down. So if the apps were using these particular servers, and those servers were using CrowdStrike, they're down until this update gets rolled back and the new update gets implemented.
Now, Mr. Kotak, Microsoft says it is taking mitigation actions. What are some of those mitigation measures?
So a lot of these systems have redundancies that are built into it. So for example, when one system fails, it can piggyback off another system. It just literally passes the baton. It's not as smooth sometimes as one may think, and this is built in for what we call disaster recovery and business continuity as well. So when these servers go down, other servers can kick in. But depending on the scale of the servers impacted, sometimes it just takes a little bit of time to pass over that baton and then fix the problem and then bring those services back onto the original servers.
And what impact can we see here in Canada?
The impact that we're probably going to see in Canada is if you're using services that are leveraging those particular servers and applications built on top of it, then you just won't be able to use those services. And what we've also seen is individuals using CrowdStrike. This is probably systems and software that is deployed by your IT department in bigger corporations to protect your laptop and your devices. You just won't be able to turn them on until the current update is rolled back and the new update is installed.
And what do you think the financial repercussions of this outage will
be? Humiliation.
It's going to be massive. There's going to be, anytime we've seen a IT outage, especially one of this scale, and there have been a few major outages throughout history, it's been extremely costly. There's multiple issues. First of all, there's lost revenue. There's the fact that you got to call in your IT department in the middle of the night to address these issues. There is obviously the technical resources that need to be brought in as well. And then there's going to be some sort of after action investigation. How happen? How can this be prevented from happening in the future with new systems being implemented? This is very expensive stuff.
Okay, well, this is really good information. Thank you for sharing
very
with us
informative.
this morning, Mr. Kotak. That is Ritesh Kotak. He is a
Very informative, yes.
Peu importe l'occasion, le restaurant du Manoir du Lac William a tout indiqué. Pour déjeuner, dîner.
Well,
Okay.
if I was to express a preference for Pierre Trudeau's approach
The
versus
memoir,
Justin
yes.
Trudeau's
So
approach,
high end.
I actually
So classy.
preferred the Pierre Trudeau way because he just wanted to steal our wealth. He didn't want to destroy it. This current
Welcome back to Moose and Loose. And today's top stories, we've got Daniel Smith being interviewed by Jordan Peterson, and they absolutely destroy the Liberals and Trudeau on energy, LNG, oil and gas, coal, climate change. They go full out, as well as one of Trudeau's ministers is stepping down. It's not even one of the backbenchers. It's one of his best friends, one of the groomsmen at his wedding. This is some big stuff. This is embarrassing. So let's jump into this. So first up from Jordan Peterson's podcast here is this interview with Daniel Smith.
the radical left,
And
have
now
indicated
he's
very,
like
very
the
clearly
some
their
other
willingness to sacrifice the
thing
core
that's
to the
not
planet.
even the same.
And this shocked me actually, because I could see a tension developing between the low energy prices that were clearly necessary to continue lifting the world's poor out of poverty, which you would think would be the primary concern of the left, right? In principle, they stand for the marginalized and oppressed. And in principle, perhaps primarily along the economic dimension, at least that was the classic left that we had contended with, dealt with for a century in the West. But now we saw on the energy and environment front that the nature worship that's characteristic of the followers of Ehrlich, let's say, will trump any concern whatsoever for the inhabitants of Africa. To point to one place in particular, right? Because the Africans are energy poor, as are the Indians, and to some degree the Chinese, although they're rectifying that very, very rapidly. And so it seems to me that there's an unbelievable opportunity for the classic liberals who are willing to divorce themselves from the idiot progressives and the conservatives to say, no, look, if you want a real policy to alleviate poverty, there isn't anything that you can do that even comes close to the provision of cheap energy by whatever means. Now you want to keep the pollution under control, and then if it is actually the case that increasing wealth at the bottom decreases environmental load, which seems to be the case, or at least you can make that argument, and credibly, then that's a win-win solution for everyone. No more poverty and a wiser populace with regards to environmental issues from the bottom up instead of the top down.
Now you need to think, what countries have energy? Lots of energy, untapped energy. Canada. Canada is one of these countries. We have tons of energy. We have tons of natural gas, oil. We have potential not only for some wind farms and some solar, but tidal power. All of this power is going untapped. And the stuff that has been the bread and butter that has built this country, the oil and gas, is being squashed, is not being expanded like liquefying LNG and shipping that out to other countries.
I think the ants are getting high off my weed. I'm not kidding.
And so
I think they're getting drunk off my alcohol too.
More on top of it because it actually improves the planet from an environmental point of view. And you've mentioned Bjorn Lombard, and I think Michael Schellenberger has done good work on this as well. But one of the things that I have heard as I've gone out talking about the value proposition that Alberta has to offer is I'm told that if we don't provide that secure supply of LNG so that they can be using it for their energy needs, they're actually quite worried in places like the Asian countries and in India that if we can't provide them with whether it's ammonia or LNG or some kind of hydrogen carrier, that they're just going to have to keep on developing coal-fired plants.
Of course they will. Of course,
And all of the
and coal has advantages. You can stockpile coal like mad. All you have to do is put it in a
Like
pile.
me?
It's pretty straightforward. And so, of course, they're going to turn to coal. Why? Because there's absolutely no way that these developing countries, where most of the people are going to be able to withstand the pressure from the population with regards to the necessity of economic growth. And so, well, we already saw this. We saw this in Germany. The Germans took this demented tilt towards green environmentalism. What's happened is that their electricity is 5 times as expensive as it should be, and they pollute more. Not least because they have to burn lignite. That's how it's turned out. Lignite, for God's sake, the most polluting form of coal. They shut their power plants down, which was utterly insane. And so what's happened in Germany is they're more dependent on, like Putin, for example. Their energy costs have spiraled out of control. They're deindustrializing.
Yeah, well, I
as a
just know what he's fucking
consequence.
doing.
And they
So
pollute more. So, like, the only way that's a victory is if all you wanted to do to begin with was cause as much havoc and disruption as possible.
You know, it's funny you should say that because one of my MLAs in the legislature, and just listening at what our opponents in the New Democratic Party had to say, he came up with this formula that the progressives have, is that they identify a problem and then they identify a solution that will make things worse. And then they criticize conservatives who have solutions that are actually a lot and may work, and try to demonize the solutions that we take. But you're absolutely right, is that there's this maybe sort of a it's plausible that the approach that they would take would work. It's plausible that if you built out an economy based on nothing but wind and solar and batteries, that everybody would have free electricity, drive prices down, and it would be unlimited because the wind is always blowing somewhere and the sun is always shining somewhere. And if you just interconnected enough, then it should work. And I think that plausible lie has been on the heart of why it is we've had such dysfunctional policy around how we develop our energy sector. You need to have reliable power. That should be number one. It should go without saying that if fuel source that only works 10% of the time in the case of sun in our market, or 30% of the time in the case of wind, is not something that you can power an industrialized economy on. And then on top of that, if you try to add everything onto the power grid so that all of your industrial use has to come from electricity, all of your heating has to come from electricity, all of your transportation has to come from electricity, at some point it gets absurd and it gets obvious that it is unachievable. But I think that there's this aspirational approach that they put out there. The people want it to be true, and so they continue to endorse policies that are completely incapable. It's impossible to be able to implement them. And it's our job as conservatives to understand where that aspiration comes from. I think people are good-hearted. They actually want to have less impact on the planet. We all enjoy our beautiful outdoor spaces. And so we want to make sure that we're not doing anything that's going to impact biodiversity. So I think that there is a human need to be in touch with nature, that they're able to, I think, take advantage of, to propose policies that simply won't work. So
yeah, that's a great point. They're tugging at the heartstrings with this, and sure, in a utopian society, we would just have solar panels laying around everywhere and it would work. And maybe efficiency gets to a point where that is possible, but that's not possible right now. So let's jump over right now and look at the coal numbers. Let's look at some graphs of the coal exports coming out of Canada. This is under Justin Trudeau, under Stephen Guilbeault. First up, we got this Canadian coal exports, 14 billion, of which 29% goes to Japan. So this chart here, you can see, starts in 2005. If we go over to 2015 right here, this is where Trudeau gets in power. So they had been going up, and the exports is the green one here. Imports has been going down for a while. But the green one is what we're looking at here. So Harper was in power here, and it was going down to there. Justin Trudeau gets into power, and it goes back up. We have the world event, which happened here, and it's going back up. So Stephen Guilbeault came in like right here. So, like, you would expect when Guilbeault came in, if this is his number one priority, this would go down, but it's going back up. So they want us to make sacrifices, major sacrifices, yet they still have no problem with exporting coal to other countries in the world like Japan, China, all around the world. This is hypocrisy at its best. We got this one here. It says Canada coal exports up 13.6% month over month in November 2023. Some of the more recent numbers are harder to get, but this is at the end of last year here. We got this graph here, which is very interesting from the National Observer. All these lines are different countries. China is this blue one here, the dark blue, and Japan is this teal colored one, and then South Korea. So those are kind of the main players here. If we look at the chart here, it says Canadian metallurgical coal exports from January 2015 to basically the end of last year. So this is when Trudeau got into power, basically. So Trudeau gets into power here. I don't know if they set up this graph because of that reason or if it just works out that way, but basically Trudeau gets into power and this is what the coal exports do. Now we have the world event right here, which is why it dove off a cliff, and you can see China here. So now it is dropping a bit here, but I mean, this is a huge delta between there and there. Guilbeault got in here somewhere. So when Trudeau had that election in 2019 and he put in Guilbeault, this is what happened after Guilbeault. So does he want to stand up and explain himself? Because what's going on here? Why would we dramatically increase our coal exports if climate change is the number one thing and we need to be doing our part? We need to be showing China. This is not about climate change, drastically exporting more coal to them. It's all a big scam. Found this chart here is interesting. It's on climateactiontracker.org. And so this is for Canada, and it shows basically the policies, and it shows here red is highly inefficient. Basically, according to this website, we're supposed to be down in the green. Yellow is like kind of okay, almost efficient. And so here's where the policies are. Here's where the planned policies are supposed to be, this purple line. So even like the Liberals are not even close to the planned policies. They like to talk a big game, but really they're failing at even what they're trying to do, and it's just dramatically hurting our economy.
Well, there's also a shadow side to that, just like there was a shadow side to the fossil fuel industry's presumption that if they marketed themselves in a green way, that would be a net economic advantage to them. That all presumes that the people that you're contending with are playing a fair game. And I actually don't believe that that's the case with much of the environmental nonsense. I feel that way, for example, when I go into a hotel and I see signs everywhere telling me that they're only going to do laundry every 2 days because they're saving the planet. And that isn't why they're not doing laundry. They're not doing laundry because it saves money, and fair enough. But they can cover that with this claim of environmental virtue. And so many of the people who virtue signal on the environmental side, and this is particularly true in the political realm on the left, are doing that not because they care for the environment in the least, not if it came to actually making personal sacrifices for doing something about it. They want to be seen to be the saviors of the planet without doing any of the work, any of the background work, any of the research, any of the industrial innovation that would be necessary to carry it out. They want to be seen as experts without noting, for example, well, how the hell are you going to interconnect all the world's power grids together? Where are you going to get the wire? Where are you going to get the metal? And isn't it a problem, not only that wind works 10% of the time, but when it doesn't work, you have to have a parallel energy system in place. And if that's not nuclear, it has to be fossil fuels. And so then instead of having just a fossil fuel grid, let's say, for our electrified economy, you have to have a wind and a solar grid plus a fossil fuel grid. How in the world could anyone with any sense whatsoever think that constituted an improvement? Especially when you also decide, let's say, to take nuclear out of the equation, which is the last thing you do if you actually cared about carbon dioxide production. And so for me, it's not even, there is an element of care with regards to environmental sustainability, but there's a much larger element of being seen, to be seen praying in public, to put it bluntly.
This is exactly Justin Trudeau. He flies around on his huge jet, burning tons of jet fuel, going all around the world. He doesn't need to fly around this much. He likes it. He likes having the private jet. He likes jet setting. He brings his kids with him. Hey, let's go see the world. We'll go to Italy. We'll go here. Yeah, we'll do a meeting, etc. He burns the carbon. He's not setting the standard. He doesn't live by his own rules. He has his own set of rules, but we have to live by a different set of rules. He's the biggest hypocrite. He loves to virtue signal. He doesn't want to do any of the hard work of bringing down emissions.
To be seen virtue signaling with no effort. And so, but NDP in particular are good at that.
So the fact that certain Western nations like Germany was set up with nuclear and they took that down and now they're in a worse position, it just screams of terrible leadership. These are bad leaders making bad decisions. You should solidify your base, then go out and find this new utopian power source if it exists, set that up, and get that to be equal to your base load of power that you need, that your nuclear, for example, is providing, and then you can start taking that nuclear offline if this new utopian power works. Why would you just take that offline and hope for the best? Now we got to go back to using dirty coal. These are bad decisions by bad world leaders. So next up here, we have another clip. So that was just a one-off clip they have on their website. But this is a full interview here. I'm not going to play this whole thing, but Jordan Peterson and his team are very good about letting creators show a little bit of his interviews. In turn, it brings more people back to his videos, which is how this should work. But I just want to play one other short clip from this interview here, and then I'll link up this in the end here if you guys want to check out the full interview, which I highly recommend. So this next clip here, they talk about natural gas, just to kind of go a little bit further than talking about the coal.
I found out recently that Quebec has enough natural gas to supply its own needs for 200 years, or the EU for 50, given known reserves. And the Quebecois have decided that they're not going to utilize that resource, even though they sold the rights to its development to someone who they later turned their back on. So that's fun. And at the same time, they're receiving massive transfer payments from Alberta and demonizing the Alberta economy as the producer of the very wealth upon which they're dependent. That doesn't seem particularly sustainable to me. And so
That's absolutely ridiculous. If you're not familiar, in Canada, we have these equalization transfer payments. So the provinces like Alberta that makes the most money has to pay in more money than that gets distributed mostly to Atlantic Canada, who doesn't make as much money. So every province kind of gets an equalized average amount of money, despite Alberta making gangbusters way more money than any other province in Canada. So basically, Jordan's pointing out here, Quebec could be making gangbusters cash themselves if they actually just went and developed the natural gas they have.
I'm curious, like, how do you contemplate? I know there is going to be an election in a year, and probably Trudeau and his minions are going to vanish into the haze with any luck. But how do you envision a relationship in a continuing Canada, given the mass split between, let's say, the interests of the West and the apparent interests of consumers and governments alike in central Canada and particularly in Quebec? So, on the optimistic side, what do you see? What do you see as the way forward?
Well, if I was to express a preference for Pierre Trudeau's approach versus Justin Trudeau's approach, I actually preferred the Pierre Trudeau way, because he just wanted to steal our wealth. He didn't want to destroy it. This current Trudeau the Younger actually wants to destroy our wealth, and I just can't imagine how he thinks that is good for the entire country, because Alberta, as you rightly point out, is a major contributor not only to the prosperity of our own province, but because so much of the corporate tax revenue and personal income tax revenue and sales tax revenue goes to Ottawa. They are a massive beneficiary of the fact that we have a strong and growing economy. So my way of dealing with that is to just point out they don't really have a mandate to govern in any meaningful sense. He only got 32% of the vote in the last election. He had a partnership with the NDP, which I see Jagmeet Singh spends almost as much time criticizing Justin Trudeau as I do, and yet he continues to prop him up.
He's the worst hypocrite in Canadian politics ever.
He is. As I should know too, the Conservatives got 34%. Instead of 33 like Trudeau. It's because of the different districts and the votes and all that. It's the same thing in America. If you get certain areas, you can win despite not having a popular vote.
And people are seeing it, because look at the result that just happened in Toronto, where an historically Liberal riding, not only did the Liberals lose ground, but the NDs lost ground as well. Both are seeing, the public is seeing that they are one and the same in the kind of damage that they're causing to our economy. Now, talking about Quebec, every time I see my colleague, Premier François Legault, I remind him that he has the ability to solve his own energy problems. And it's going to get to a crucial point in Quebec, and I'm quite interested to see how it plays out. You may recall that Quebec signed a very favorable deal for the Churchill Falls hydroelectric power, which is located in Newfoundland and Labrador, a 70-year deal that has the value that they pay going down over time, if you can even imagine. I think they're only paying a fraction of a cent right now for access to that power. Problem is, that deal runs out in 18 years, and we're already beginning to see the impact that is having on their market. They can't offer 20-year power purchase agreements to new industrial installations because they don't own the right past 18 years. And they're now going to be at a point where their energy export, as I've seen, National Bank just did a study on this, where their energy exports are going to fall off. Their energy exports have been part of the reason why they've been able to continue to not only get money from the Western Canada, but also have the ability to subsidize subsidize their own population. And so the model is falling apart in Quebec. And the solution is very obvious. It is not to build more hydroelectric plants. We've now seen that hydroelectric can take even longer to build than a pipeline in our country. In British Columbia, Site C began in 1954, and it took decades before they finally got to a point where they could build it. And now it's massively over budget for the amount of megawatts that are coming on stream. And so that isn't going to be a solution in Quebec. The solution is the one that we're pursuing, natural gas. I call it a destination fuel, not just a transition fuel. It's both. But even if you use the language from the agreement that came out of the COP meeting last year, they talk about how important natural gas is as a transition to whatever comes next. And that transition maybe is into a hydrogen economy.
Right.
And I put it to Quebec every time I see them, that's what they should be focused on. How do you use the technology that we've already developed to be able to capture the CO2, maybe put it to a useful purpose, develop out your hydrogen economy, develop perhaps an ammonia economy. They have the ability to solve this problem themselves, but they have become so invested in a negative approach to how we talk about the traditional resources or fossil fuels that I don't know if they'll be able to have that conversion. I'll be watching to see, but they're power constrained now. They're just not going to be able to grow their economy unless they figure out how to be able to bring in a secure supply and an affordable supply of electricity.
Yeah, that's a real nail in the coffin for Quebec. I mean, if Legault had half a brain here, he would take some notes from what Danielle Smith is saying and start implementing this stuff right away. The clock is ticking there in Quebec. The fact that they have everything they need to be so prosperous, yet they're still taking handouts from Alberta is absolutely ridiculous. That's where to leave this episode. Highly recommend checking out the rest of it here. I'll link it up at the end. But next up, let's take a look at Trudeau's minister that will be stepping down, one of his good buddies. It's none other than Seamus O'Regan stepping down from cabinet, won't run for re-election. Yeah, you're not going to win that re-election, buddy. But it says a lot. It really says a lot that he just basically, the reason here, we'll get into it, but it basically says he doesn't support Trudeau and going further on. As I mentioned in my previous video, I think you guys could just go get a pineapple and put it in that chair. It'll do just as good, actually an even better job. So just head over to your local Loblaws or Metro or whatever one you want to pick, Walmart. But it says here, Seamus O'Regan announced Thursday he's resigning from Canada, won't seek re-election. O'Regan, 53, is staying on as an MP until the general election. He said that in a media statement posted on social media, ultimately, my family comes first. Yeah, sure, buddy. What comes down to it, you guys are getting absolutely worked. You're going to get thrown out of power. You're all going to lose your seats. So sure, this looks a little bit better for him. He's kind of jumping ship before the ship goes under. I need to be a better husband, son, uncle, and friend. And this job means and deserves a lot of time in order to do it well. He was elected to Parliament in 2015 as MP from St. John's. Reagan has been in cabinet since 2017, also held the Natural Resources, Indigenous Services, and Veteran Affairs portfolios. And it's amazing how they toss these guys around like the Pokemon cards. These guys don't have expertise in any of these areas. And they just throw them around like, oh yeah, you can be in charge of this. Like, shouldn't you have someone who has mastery?
I'm sorry, if there are no natives who might want the game.
Finance, etc., be the finance minister, and in his case, the federal labor and seniors minister, natural resources, or any of those positions. These guys should have serious knowledge and mastery in those positions. But when it comes down to it, most of these guys are just lawyers and have zero knowledge of this, which is ridiculous. Sources tell CBC News and Radio Canada that Reagan will be replaced by Gatineau MP Steve McKinnon, who's been serving as House Leader, while Karina Gould is on parental leave. So Karina Gould comes back, Steve McKinnon shifts over. That's basically what's going on here. The new Minister of Labour and Seniors will be sworn in at Radio Hall on Friday, the Prime Minister's office, PMO said. So there you have it. His groomsman and good buddy is stepping down. He's not going to continue supporting Trudeau. That must really hurt. It says a lot, whether it is just for family reasons or not. It's not good optics. So let's jump over to my group now and see what memes we've got today. We've got this here. It says, if we're going to build more public transit, we should build housing next to it. It's that simple. This was posted on July 17th, 2024. If we go back 2 years ago, I will require cities to pre-approve permits for high-density housing and employment at all future stations of all federally funded major transit projects. This is coming from Pierre Poilievre. So yes, here's Trudeau once again, just scooping up one of Pierre Poilievre's ideas. It's not going to work though, because the people don't trust you, Trudeau, because you don't actually have follow-through. There's a lot of talk and not a lot of action. Before carbon taxes, after carbon taxes. Blackstone to acquire Ancestry.com for $4.7 billion, giving investment firm total ownership of DNA of every person who's ever used the service. Yeah, so my neighbor had one of those. They actually got an extra one in the mail, and I've been meaning to do it. Who posted said never send your DNA to somewhere because then they have that record.
Yeah.
They always have that, and so I've never sent that in. As someone who's been a victim of identity theft multiple times now, I think I'm going to pass.
Yeah.
Who knows what they do with your information? Is this Mr. Beast? If inflation went up 3% according to your report, the government, then how come everything is 50% more expensive? Breaking, we've got Ford announces plan project in Oakville and will produce gasoline and diesel F-Series Super Duty pickups instead. Huh, that's interesting. Definitely saw that one coming. One bedroom Vancouver apartment located next to the water, $2,600. Ice cube soup. Follow me for more recipes. Yeah, this is new national delicacy, Canadian delicacy.
Prime Minister, what does it say about your government that Seamus O'Regan is leaving cabinet and not running again?
I don't know if that music is copyrighted.
What are you discussing in cabinet tomorrow?
Yeah, he's not going to say anything. He doesn't even wave to the camera anymore. He's just like walks around. He puts his little smug smile on and goes into his motorcade of 77 cars. That's what wrap up this episode. Let me know in the comments down below what you guys thought about Daniel Smith and Jordan Peterson's conversation there on energy and climate change and all that. As well as Seamus O'Regan stepping down, Trudeau's secret meeting. There's a lot going on here in summertime. I thought things would be a little bit slower, but it seems like it's just kind of ramping up. So let me know what you guys think. Thanks for watching today's video here. Be sure to hit the thumbs up. Subscribe if you haven't subscribed, and subscribe to my other channel because things are not so peachy over here. I keep getting restricted on my videos when I upload them here. I spent 5 hours trying to troubleshoot my own video because YouTube doesn't tell me what's wrong with them when I upload stuff. Often it'll just be one word or one 5 seconds of imagery or whatever it may be. I actually took yesterday's video, which is 23 minutes long. I chopped it into 23 segments that were 1 minute each, uploaded all of them to try to find the problem, and then I can fix it or delete it or whatever. But even then, sometimes you upload a segment and it says green, it's fine, and then you upload it again and then it'll flag it. Like the system's kind of dumb like that. It's just a robotic thing, and sometimes it's a case of mistake something for whatever because it's a robotic system. In my case, I had a clip of Palestinian protests, and there was a bunch of guys wearing black outfits that were cleaning up garbage. But then the system looks like they thought it was a bunch of those guys from America who wear the black outfits, who have a four-letter word on their shirt that starts with an S and ends in a T. Maybe there's a W and an A in there as well. And I thought there was those guys. That's what I think. So I had to completely cut that out because I can't tell the system, hey, that's not actually those guys. It's just guys cleaning up garbage. The only other option for me is to send it in for approval, which is what I had to do this morning. It was 5 a.m. I had to go to sleep. So I just went to bed and I sent it in for approval. And then 5 hours later, they finally approved my video. Seeing how this is a daily show, I can't send it in for approval every day. It's getting ridiculous. So what I'm doing is splitting these videos now. Anything that's, maybe confuses the algorithm a bit or whatever, I'll put it on my second channel because the algorithm over there doesn't have a problem at all. Because I play by the rules. I don't show stuff that is not allowed. But the system keeps messing up. But for whatever reason, my second channel, it doesn't do that. So going forward, I'm going to be splitting my videos and putting more on my second channel to show you guys what's going on that I'm not able to put here. I don't know if someone has come and cracked down on this because there's a lot of views coming in here and I keep sharing the truth of what's going on and they don't like that. I recently put out a video on my second channel about a certain company and I had, I think the guy he's lying, but they're a big company. Maybe they had something to say with it. Maybe it's just the government. Maybe it's Trudeau and the Liberals. Maybe it's someone else. Maybe it's some donors of Trudeau's that doesn't like. I don't know. But it's very suspicious that suddenly out of nowhere I'm having all these problems. Because the same day, also having problems with my Facebook account. My Facebook account has been locked down now for 6 days too, on the exact same day, right at the exact same time. So you guys let me know what you think about that. I have my own thoughts about it. Thanks for watching the end of the video here. Be sure to subscribe to the channel, like the video, all that good stuff. Keep fighting for freedom here. Be sure to subscribe to my second channel. I'll put it up right here on this side as an extra layer of protection. And quite honestly, I think I'm going to make a third one because at this point, I probably need one if I'm not going to be completely erased off the universe here. So we'll keep fighting for freedom. I'll see you guys in the next one.
do what they want to do. If I gave somebody $100,000 to shut their mouth and not bring up any family problem, how much you want to bet that they would shut up?
That is
People don't control themselves because they don't want to control themselves. There's no such thing as
I agree. That's my whole leftist thing. I think they realize that their positions are crap, but they don't want to be brave and change them, or at least publicly come out against them, because they think it personally and professionally advantages them. I agree with you that it's about wanting. There are some people who are just too far gone. And if there's anything I've realized in my life,
the condition is pathetic.
you can't control. There's only managing the situation.
I am the reason I raise this is I want to go back to my whole thesis of life. You make a better world behaviorally, not emotionally.
I talked to a young analyst who was looking and tracking at Justin Trudeau's declining popularity. And he also was tracking the number of mortgage renewals that are happening each month. It tracks perfectly. Then they look around and say, who's caused this? And the obvious answer is the guys who've been in charge for the last 9 years. And it's happening in real time and happening very quickly, and it will probably accelerate.
So I'm talking today to Premier Danielle Smith of Alberta. And Alberta is a very interesting province because it's extremely energy rich, fossil fuels in particular. And so Alberta is perhaps the foremost jurisdiction in the world where the battle between anti-human green environmentalism and the industries that promote cheap and accessible energy is being fought. And so it's always interesting to me to concentrate on the situation in Alberta because it has international repercussions. So I'll give you an example. Within the last 2 years, both the leaders of Germany and Japan have come to Canada asking for liquid natural gas, and Premier Trudeau, our narcissist in chief, has decided that that interferes with his vision of, I don't know, his progression through the WEF ranks or something like that. God only knows. But we turned Germany and Japan away, cap in hand, which was a colossal error. So that's a good example of why what's happening in Alberta has international significance. So I talked to Premier Danielle Smith, a very sharp lady today, about the conflict between the energy industry and the radical environmentalists being played out in Canada, with Justin Trudeau being, what would you say, the face of the top-down globalist utopians who would ravage the poor in their counterproductive attempts to fail to save the planet. We talked about the development of an invitational vision on the conservative side, what it is now that conservatives have to offer young people. And it's essentially something approximating the invitation to the responsible adventure of life, a vision predicated on the idea that the best things that you do in your life are going to be the things associated with your willingness to take responsibility. So we might as well dive right in and attack something simple. And so that would be Bill C-59, let's say, and the, what would you say, the relationship between federal energy and environment policies and, well, let's call it the whole economy of the West and probably of Canada as well. So do you want to first lay out the territory with regard to Bill C-59? Because that was the occasion for this particular conversation.
Well, it's funny because Bill C-59 reminded me of American policymaking, where ostensibly it's about one thing, and then they stuff in hundreds of pages of other things, knowing that it has to pass, and all of those terrible other addendums are going to pass along with it. Because this is the Budget Implementation Act. It had to pass, because in our parliamentary system, if you don't pass the budget, you end up having to go to an election. And so you're ending up having to swallow a lot of terrible policy because there's things in there that you support. Like there's things in there that we do support as well when it comes to some of the tax measures that they're taking. But what they slid in at the last minute was this crazy policy that had initially been put forward by one of our most extreme NDP members of parliament, Charlie Angus, who's not even running again. This is kind of his last ditch effort, I guess, to try to have an influence on the national stage. And Catherine McKenna, the former environment minister as well, on as a UN envoy on, I don't know if it's UN envoy on eco-truth or something, I don't know what it is, but it's very clear that she had an influence in sliding into this budget implementation bill, making it illegal for the energy sector, oil and gas, to talk about their positive environmental record, what they're doing to reduce emissions, the successes that they've had in addressing the environment. It's now rendered essentially illegal unless they can conform with some kind of international standard for reporting, which is undefined. Nobody knows what that is. International standard, who's setting those? What are they? No one knows. And the industry is very fearful that they're going to end up with a whole pile of frivolous lawsuits that'll bind them in the courts for months, or in our case of our country, years. And as a result, this is what has happened. The energy industry takes the path of least resistance. They want to focus on creating prosperity and investment in developing resources. They don't want to be fighting extreme eco-justice warriors about whether or not they were overstating any particular measure of their history. So what we're seeing now is the only people who are going to be allowed in this space are those who, quite frankly, many times are not telling the truth about our energy sector. And I think that is not good for Canada. It's not good for our province. It's really not good for the world, because we want to be the reliable provider of energy to our trade partners. And I think that they've taken us a step backwards with this, massive step backwards.
Okay, so let's delve into this a little bit. So I do remember that this bill came up, the one you're referring to that now got slotted in. This bill came up perhaps a year and a half ago. And the buzz around it was that it essentially criminalized speech that was related to of the fossil fuel industry. And there was enough of a furor around that, it seemed to kill it. But obviously, it just went underground and reemerged in this more serpentine form, very underhanded move. And so, so first of all, why is this not unconstitutional? Second, why can't the corporations already be prosecuted for fraud if that's actually what they're engaged in, or false advertising? And then these international standards that hypothetically exist, who sets them, even in principle? And like, is that an elected body, or is that some unelected cabal of top-down globalists like the UN? So let's start with why isn't this an unconstitutional move? Why isn't this another abrogation of free speech in Canada?
It is. And this is the thing that's so remarkable, is that I was reading an analysis of the Liberals, and the Liberals are the most illiberal government we've ever had. When you look at what liberalism, classical liberalism is supposed to stand for, it's supposed to stand for those foundational freedoms that I thought were enshrined in our Charter of Rights and Freedoms, certainly enumerated in various bills of rights. And freedom of conscience and the ability to speak your mind is the first enumerated freedom. And yet it is being trampled all over, whether it's with the internet censorship bills, whether it's the hollowing out of the media and then having to scramble after federal dollars. I don't know what kind of strings attached are associated with that, or whether it is with the speech codes, whether it's in universities, professional associations, and now this is a new speech code. It's a speech code on the energy sector. The good news is that they have a carve out for the other orders of government. And so as the leader of the Alberta government, and we are the owner of this resource, oil and natural gas, we own about 85% of the resource. I have made it very clear that we are not going to stop our advocacy. What we hope to be is that source of solid information about our environmental record. And then by providing that validation and showing our work, showing our sources, we hope that we'll be able to give that same information to the other advocacy groups and industry so that we can all go forward together. But that's the situation we now find ourselves in, is that we're having to have a government take on the role of being the advocate, because they're crowding out the private voices, which I think has got to be the most illiberal approach to take to the discussion of these kinds of issues. So we are intending on behalf of the industry to challenge this from a constitutional perspective and to challenge it as well from a charter perspective. And so as we put together that lawsuit, we will be reaching out to others to see if they want to join us as well, because we've had some success in beating back the federal government. It takes years, it takes a lot of money. That's why they do these things, is that because they have a period of time where it is the law of the land until you can get it struck down through the various stages of the court. And in the meantime, they put such a chill on investment that they achieve their target regardless, because they just put it in as the fact by having it implemented in the parliament. It's so irresponsible.
What would happen if the oil companies, if the fossil fuel companies used information that you had already promoted?
We're hoping.
Okay.
We're hoping that we'll be able to almost provide a shield that if we become, because you asked who sets the standards. Well,
right.
Guess what? I think we set the standard. I mean, we under our constitution have the right to develop our resource and get them to market. And part of getting them to market is also making sure that we can tell the environmental message. Because the other part of it too, and I've spoken with energy executives about this as they're trying to navigate through it, they actually have an international requirement in reporting to their shareholders as publicly traded companies to talk about their environmental record. So you can't have both of those things. You have to be able to give them that latitude. So we are hoping to be able to provide them a bit of that shield and be able to also lead on the legal issues and the judicial issues. But make no mistake, there's only one reason why this was put into the legislation at the last minute, and it's because the Liberal government with their NDP supporters want to crush any confidence in developing our energy sector. They want to crush the production of oil and natural gas, even though they use weasel words to try to pretend otherwise. There's an agenda to keep it in the ground. We do not agree. We believe we can reduce emissions.
Okay, so let's delve into that a little bit. I mean, first of all, what do you actually think their vision for the Canadian economy might be? Canada's a very resource-dependent country, and we've done a very, very bad job of differentiating ourselves in a more sophisticated way. Certainly under the Liberal leadership in Ottawa. They've done a disastrous job of assuring an increase in Canadian productivity. I think we're now down to 60% on average GDP production per capita compared to the US, with real estate that's twice as expensive, right? It's worse than, what's the state? I can't remember. It's the lowest ranking United States state.
Detroit.
Canada is now equivalent to in terms of GDP productivity, and with much more expensive real estate. So that's just absolutely appalling. So do you think that underlying all this, like what the hell's driving this? Is this merely climate paranoia of the type that's fostered by the WEF? Is that what's going on? And is there an idea that's lurking in the back of what passes for the minds of people like Stephen Guilbeault, something like the promotion of degrowth, because that's actually the only way out of the climate catastrophe? Like, I don't understand what's lurking at the bottom of this precisely, and so I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that matter.
Transport minister is what's
Well, I
lurking
think
at the
it goes
bottom
back
of it.
further. I mean, I started studying the environmental movement when I was an intern at the Fraser Institute in 95, 96. And it was just after some of the early climate conferences. But that's when I learned about the Rio Summit and the role that a Canadian by the name of Maurice Strong had played in asserting that we needed to put an approach on emissions reduction that was very aggressive. And there has been, I think even it goes back further than that to the Club of Rome concept, I think came out in the late 1960s. And earlier than that, the Paul Ehrlich and Limits to Growth, this whole notion that the world did not have enough resources to be able to keep up with the population growth, that we would ultimately outpace our ability to feed ourselves. That was sort of the flawed principle that came out of the late 1960s and early 70s. I mean, it was even, if you look at the culture and how it's shaped by movies, you may recall the movie Soylent Green. And it talked about a catastrophic future, which I think we've now superseded in the date that they expected it to happen, where we'd run out of food, so you had to have a manufactured product to keep people alive. And so this is I think the flawed premise that goes all the way back there.
Didn't run out of food though.
How
They
much
banned
we're
food.
able to develop new resources and increase food productivity and outpace the global population with our production. They still stay with that flawed premise. And you hear it even today, where they talk about you need 5 Earths to be able to support the number of people that we have on the planet. Now, it's just simply not true, because the way economics works is as something becomes more scarce and precious, someone will find a substitute product. And it's been the history that we always find a solution to be able to meet these concerns. That's how supply and demand works. So I think it goes back even further. And one of the reasons I mentioned Maurice Strong is he was an appointee in Justin Trudeau's father's era, in Pierre Elliott Trudeau's era. And I think that is the vision that our Prime Minister has, is he felt like that was a moment of relevance for Canada, is look at us, we are going to be the first to go forward on these kinds of aggressive policies. And it's the only way I can understand when he got reelected, for him to use the international forum he had to say Canada's back, and back in the worst possible way for Canadians, which is these taxes on productivity. I've actually heard the carbon tax referred to as a sin tax on productivity, which really helps to identify the way they look at the production of methane and carbon dioxide, and all of the attendant policies that have been put forward. We're far more aggressive than any of our trading partners in establishing net zero policies. By 2050, no, that's not good enough. It's got to be by 2035 or 2030, or we've got to have unrealistic targets to phase out combustion engine vehicles faster than anyone else. And I think it's really just this flawed interpretation of what it means to be relevant on the international stage. I mean, I think being relevant on the international stage for Canada means meeting our commitment on defense spending, being a reliable ally when we go into conflict zones, making sure that we have an effective immigration system so that we are able to assimilate people into our economy and not drive up and have massive inflation, manage our money supply, effectively manage our passports so that we can ensure that we've got those kind of documents available without months or years worth of waste. I mean, there's just some very practical things that we can see the federal government do to be relevant on the international stage. And
how about provide natural gas to Germany and Japan? It's like they asked.
100%. 100%. I mean, this is part of what I was observing before I got into this position, is that the world assumes when they come to Canada that the leader, the prime minister of the country, is going to be an advocate for the country and an advocate for the resource development. It's part of the reason we structured our country the way we did. We've given trade and commerce powers, and we've given international trade power agreements to our federal government to negotiate in our best interest on our behalf.
Asked, like, why weren't
using
you
it for
here?
the reverse.
Because
He's
you
actually
came up
using
the
it to
fucking
put up
day.
trade barriers
He was
to not
like,
build the
you know what?
infrastructure that we need.
It was a bad judgment call on my part. My bad.
With our ability to get our product to market.
My family really needed a vacation.
I've had to take the stance that I've had. It's not the role necessarily of a provincial premier, a subnational government, to have to go to the COP28 or COP29 international conferences. But if we're not there, our voice doesn't get heard. Our story doesn't get told. We don't have an opportunity to talk to international trading partners, whether it's Germany or South Korea or Japan or India, about how we might be able to solve energy security problems. So I found myself, as you've got a federal prime minister who seems to be more interested in doing my job, talking about dentistry programs and school lunch programs, I'm finding increasingly I'm having to do his job in reaching out to the world and making them know that we are going to be a trading partner, and we are going to be a secure supply of not only energy but food as well. So that's the weird upside down nature we find ourselves in Canada right now.
Have you ever browsed in incognito mode? It's probably not as incognito as you think. Google recently settled a $5 billion lawsuit after being accused of secretly tracking users in incognito mode. Their defense, quote, incognito does not mean invisible. Even in incognito mode, all of your online activity is still 100% visible to third parties, unless you use ExpressVPN. Without ExpressVPN, third parties can still see every website you visit. That includes your internet service provider, mobile network provider, and the admins of your Wi-Fi network. ExpressVPN reroutes 100% of your traffic through secure encrypted servers, so third parties can't see your browsing history. ExpressVPN hides your IP address, making it extremely difficult for third parties to track your online activity. It sounds complicated, but I promise you, it's actually so easy to use. Just fire up the app and tap one button to get protected. I love ExpressVPN because it works on all my devices, so I can stay secure when I'm on the go. Protect your online privacy today by visiting expressvpn.com/Jordan. That's expressvpn.com/Jordan, and you can get an extra 3 months free. expressvpn.com/Jordan today.
So, a couple of things on that. So, Paul Ehrlich, who wrote The Population Bomb and is still kicking around, made a very famous bet with an economist, Julian Simon. He asked Simon to propose a basket of commodities, and they bet on whether those would be less or more expensive by the year 2000, because that was the doomsday date as far as Dr. Ehrlich was concerned. And he famously, Simon, who was an absolute genius as opposed to Ehrlich, who certainly presumed he was one, famously collected on that bet shortly after the millennium switched, because the basket of commodities became far less expensive rather than more expensive. There was more of everything. And of course, the entire economic history of the world since that point has indicated exactly that. And the reason for that, because it really started to accelerate after 1989, was that the developing countries in particular stopped generating the absolutely catastrophic economic policies that were part and parcel of the communist deal, and just mostly got the hell out of the way of their people. And all of a sudden we had no problem whatsoever feeding the 9 billion people that are on the planet. And we're going to peak out at something like 13, maybe less.
That should be good.
1 in 4 Canadians may be poor. At how many Canadians are struggling with the rising cost of living? 1 in 4 people living in poverty.
These headlines shook Canada last week, and it got my attention. For a G7 country with one of the world's biggest economies, this number is surreal. These numbers mean that Canadian would be worse off than Myanmar, Ethiopia, and Dominican Republic.
Wow.
So I decided to take the same survey to see if Anna and I are living below the poverty line. And turns out we are.
We've only been living below the poverty line. My
So
whole
how's that
family
possible? So this is the report that we're looking
13,000
at.
a year.
And
The
it starts
poverty
with
was 20,000 at
establishing
the
the
time.
metric
That
that
was
matters.
10 years ago.
But it's not actually the metric that they end up
Fucking
using.
idiots.
More on that later. In Canada,
'cause
we use
everyone fucking is
MBM,
full
the
of
market
debt.
basket measure, to determine an official.
I was told when I was in high school that I have to get a credit card. And I said no, because I cannot for sure be able to always pay that credit card. And I don't want to end up in insurmountable amounts of debt. And they said, but bad credit is better than no credit. I was like, that can't be true. That cannot be actually the case. As it turns out, the more debt you have, the more likely you are to get it erased at this point. So that sucks. I was wrong. You know what? It is better to have bad credit than no credit. So that sucks. Giacomo? Doesn't it suck, Jack? Okay, we're gonna go die for a bit, because I'm dying.
Poverty line. According to the MBM, poverty thresholds are based on the cost of a basket of food, clothing, shelter, transportation, and other items representing a modest basic standard of living. The current MBM establishes thresholds for 53 different geographic regions in the provinces, which can be adjusted to different families of different sizes. When a person's or family's disposable income is below the threshold of the size of their family in a particular region, they are considered to be living in poverty. According to that metric, Canada's poverty line was around 10% in 2019. That sounds reasonable. It's definitely more reasonable than 25%. And that puts us at around the same level as Czech Republic and Mauritius.
Oh, wow.
But wait a second. Does everyone in the world use the MBM? Are we comparing apples to apples here? In short, no. MBM is a metric unique to Canada. But there is a notion of a basket in other countries too. And what's included in there varies greatly on the country's economical situation. That is to say that the richer the country, the higher the bar for the poverty line. So poverty in Canada would look very different than poverty, let's say, in North Korea or Thailand. In Canada, the NBM measures the ability of a family to purchase a basket of goods, which consists of 4 components. First, it's the nutritious food. The exact composition of that is defined by Health Canada. Then we have a clothing component. When they say that, they mean the most common work and social occasions clothing, which includes doing sports, and it also includes appropriate winter clothing. And then we have a housing component. The family should have the ability to rent a median cost 3-bedroom apartment in a community if they're a family of 4. But we do know that they adjusted based on the household size. Transportation, public and private, depending on where you live. For instance, the minimal basket measure assumes, in some regions, the cost of car ownership and associated fees. Car ownership is a pretty massive expense in itself. Depending on the car you have, where you live, and how often you drive, and the insurance you pay, it can easily be at least $1,000 monthly expense. So in Canada, you may be considered poor according to the NBM measure if you don't own a 5-year-old Chevy Cavalier.
Avoid using these boring phrases. It's all right. That's interesting. That's absolutely amazing. I thought I had a really strong vocabulary until I downloaded Elevate and took the placement test. The 70 percentile isn't bad, but it's not as high as I expected. So I started playing Elevate's award-winning brain games just 5 minutes a day, and I'm already in the 85th percentile. I'm infinitely more comfortable using more complex words and phrases, and have actually started phasing out words like literally and other filler words. You might think you have a killer vocabulary, but you won't know until you take the placement test. So find out how your vocab compares to your peers. Download Elevate today and take the placement test.
The final component of the NBM measure is being able to cover other necessary expenditures. Personal care, household needs, furniture, telephone service, reading, recreation, entertainment, and school supplies. The reading, recreation, and entertainment component also includes a newspaper subscription, video rentals, YMCA memberships, magazines, books, and tickets for movies and sports events. So how can we compare Canada to the rest of the world? The United Nations came up with a global multidimensional poverty index, and their index looks at many more things like access to drinking water, sanitation, electricity, child mortality. So on that index, Canada scored, well, it's actually not even in the list. This list covers 110 out of 195 countries in the world. And it starts with Niger and ends with Serbia. I guess the remaining 85 countries have it pretty good in comparison, Canada included. But wait, that's not the only way we measure poverty. There's also a Gini index, which measures income and wealth inequality. Canada's doing better than the USA and slightly better than Australia and the UK, but worse than Sweden, Norway, Kazakhstan, Ukraine. Wait, what? Yeah, this index is not really representative. This index measures inequality. So if everyone in the country is equally poor, that will lower the index too. OECD has a definition and a measure of the poverty rate. So basically, each country decides what their poverty line is currently. Canada sits at 10%, doing better than the UK, Germany, Australia, and Israel. But it's doing worse than Portugal, Netherlands, Norway, and Sweden. Now, let's get back to that food bank's report. There is a big quote here about the food bank's visits. It goes without saying that while increasing food bank visits is a data point worth looking at, it is highly inaccurate, since it's pretty easy to take advantage of a food bank, even when you don't really need it. What this report admits further is that the NBM measure is a measure of probability and not a definition. So there's a good deal of false negatives and false positives in this measure. This report acknowledges that. They say that you shouldn't only use inputs like income and cost of living in the case of NBM, but also output and what you can actually end up affording and activities you can participate in. So they came up with another metric, the Material Deprivation Index, which this report and their conclusions are based on. The food banks assembled a team of experts to come up with this new metric. It's actually not a new metric. Europe has already been using it for decades, and the most recent number for EU is 6.7%, which is the overall population that's experienced severe material deprivation as measured by similar but not the same items as the Canadian NBM. The food banks thought that this was not good enough. They wanted to better understand the nature of poverty in Canada and explain the gap between the NBM and the food bank experience in Canada. In other words, they were not happy with what the existing NBM data was telling them and decided to come up with their own metric. Remember the good old campaign in 1937 by the tobacco company Philip Morris, claiming that smoking a certain brand of cigarettes is healthy. Anyways, that's how the new Canadian MDI was born. The authors of the report surveyed a representative sample of approximately 2,000 Canadian residents. Then, in phase 2, they surveyed 4,600. This survey included an oversample of several groups whom they thought were at particular risk of experiencing poverty. Single parents, adults between the ages of 25 and 64, and people who identify as Indigenous, Black, or South Asian. Oversample. That means that they selected more samples from a specific population or group that is statistically representative. So let's take this survey together. Let me know in the comments what your outcomes are. We're actually going to go into the appendix of the full 100-page report and get the original questions. What's curious is this survey doesn't just start with general demographic data, but also goes on to ask the respondents about the general life outlook, including how much they trust the government. And right after that, we dive into the deprivation survey. There's also a set of questions for households with children, so we will skip these. Is everyone in your household able to eat meat or fish or a vegetarian equivalent at least every other day? How can one measure a vegetarian equivalent? Overall, our answer is yes, we are able to eat all the combination of the above. Is everyone in your household able to get around your community whenever they need to? For us, no. We live in the suburbs and only own one car. The commute is a pain in the butt. We definitely cannot afford additional expenses associated with a second car, parking, and extra gas. Does everyone in your household have at least one pair of properly fitting shoes and at least one pair of winter boots? Yes. Next, are you able to keep your house or apartment at a comfortable temperature all year round? No, we cannot. We live in an older home, so the insulation isn't ideal. The hot days of the
last
summer
winter,
can get
we
pretty
didn't
hot
refill
despite
the
the
oil
AC.
tank.
We
We
did an
just
energy
used
assessment
heaters.
recently in our home, and the energy advisor recommended that we update the roof insulation, then replace the furnace, replace the AC, and the water heater. We definitely cannot afford to do that. Are you able to participate in celebrations or other occasions that are important to people from your social, ethnic, cultural, or religious group? I think so. Next, are you able to buy some small gifts for family or friends at least once a year? Yeah. Are you currently able to pay your bills on time? Yeah. Does every adult in your household have appropriate clothes to wear for special occasions, such as a job interview, wedding, or a funeral? No, we don't. We never had to attend a wedding or a funeral, and I certainly cannot afford buying a dress or a suit that I would only wear once or twice in life. Is everyone in your household able to get regular dental care, including teeth cleaning and fillings, at least once a year? Yes. Take care of your teeth, folks. It becomes way too expensive if you don't. If you wanted to, could you spend a small amount of money each week on yourself? Yeah, I buy myself chocolate every week. If you had an unexpected expense today of $500, could you cover this expense
Absolutely
from
not.
your own resources?
Because
Yes.
I have fucking asshole junkies that steal my welfare check.
Ooh. 600? Oh, damn. Ooh. Ooh. Damn. This is one of the toughest workouts. Saturdays, 4 250s, 600 reps. Hey, but this is where champions
Please
are built.
kill yourself.
You do these workouts, when you get to the race, it's gonna be so much easier. I just gotta keep struggling until it becomes easy. Light work. Ah!
Top resume mistakes. Brought to you by myperfectresume.com. Mistake number 2, listing duties instead of accomplishments.
Lists here that you're good at sitting at a desk. Oh yeah, that's one of my skills. And call any of my references, because that's what I'm very good at. I'm interested in accomplishments, not things anyone can do.
Accomplishments are specific. They say something about you. Duties just blandly describe the responsibilities you had, but give little sense of what you brought to your previous job. Employers already know those responsibilities. They want to see what you can bring to the table. My Perfect Resume offers tools that can help you avoid these mistakes. With their tons of excellent templates and prompts, they will help you craft a resume that is specific and highlights what makes you unique.
So these are all the questions that we had. So how did we conclude that we live in poverty, like I said in the beginning of the video? This report outlines that they debated on how they should measure all of that and what are the consequences, and what they come up with is 2 items or more. So if you answer no, I cannot afford it, to at least 2 questions, you're considered to be living below the poverty line according to this survey. Interestingly, the deprivation survey methodology for Europe has only 8 individual questions and requires at least 3 no's in order to add a person to the poverty statistics. Canada, in turn, came up with 14 items and a lower poverty threshold. I'm not an economist or a scientist, but that feels slightly privileged to me. To make this clear, I'm not rejecting the notion that Canadians are experiencing higher levels of deprivation, and more Canadians are now living below the poverty line.
Yes,
These 2 are facts, but it is also a fact that the headlines and conclusions like 1 in 4 Canadians live below the poverty line are derived from experimental
Yeah, but some of us
research
inherit
and
like
maybe nothing
a
more
building
than a
or
clickbait
like
statement
whatever
meant
they
to
inherit from their
enrage
parents,
and
and some
upset
of
more
us
people.
inherit generational
It is
debt.
also a fact that Canadian credit card debt is up. NerdWallet reports more than half of Canadian adults have credit card debt.
Nope.
And 50% of
I didn't
them
get to spend
think
the
that
fucking
it will
money.
take them at least 6 months to pay off that debt. And the need to pay off these debts will yield higher levels of material deprivation in other aspects. In fact, Canadians are paying the highest
They won't even
portion
give me
of
a checking
disposable
account
income
since the
towards
trucker
debt. For
protest.
every $1 of disposable income, Canadians have $1.74 of debt to pay. This isn't just because of credit card debt, but also house debt. Many Canadians are either house poor or are paying way too much for housing, rent, food, and
Like my
necessities,
parents?
seeing no option but to get themselves into debt.
Oh no,
We
they're
live in
literally gonna
challenging
die
economic
paying off that house.
conditions, and Canada's not alone. A recent World Bank report predicts a rise in global inequality, and that most countries have experienced an increase in poverty in the last 4 years. How are the countries likely to deal with all of that? The reports outline several examples of how poverty and inequality has been dealt with historically. All countries reduce inequality through taxation,
Overthrow your
subsidies,
government?
and transfers. How exactly it's done depends on the specific country's economy and its policies. For instance, richer economies collect more revenue from direct taxes like income tax, property tax, capital gains tax. Poorer economies, in turn, rely on indirect taxes like sales tax or tax on import and export. We're not advocating for higher tax.
Oh, I work for the
but the most
natives.
economically successful countries do. Take Finland, for example. It has some of the lowest poverty rates in OECD, yet the country ranks as the happiest country in the world.
Whatever.
And it has the highest personal tax rates. And it has the 3rd highest capital gains tax in Europe, although they do have lower corporate tax rates. Perhaps there's a thing or two that we could borrow from the way the Finns approach this. The question is, will everyone be satisfied with that? Let me just leave you with something here. In Canada, you're considered living under the poverty line if you don't own a house or a car. And this is practically ingrained in the market basket minimum and the deprivation measure assessment. But I feel truly privileged to live in a country for which these are the biggest issues that the population faces. Thank you for watching, guys. Gently tap the like button if you found this video curious, and subscribe to this channel not to miss more videos about how to arrive, excel, and thrive in Canada. If you would like to support the work that we do to help us do more better content, you can join our YouTube channel membership for a small fee. You can find the links in the description box below, or simply tap the join button right next to our name. See you in the next one. Take care.
I'm working on it. You know, I would love to know why the fuck my autoplay is not on again.
One in four Canadians may be poor. And how many Canadians are struggling with the rising cost of living? One in four people living in poverty in this country.
These headlines last week, and it got my attention. For a G7 country with one of the world's biggest economies, this number is surreal. These numbers mean that Canadian would be worse off than Myanmar, Ethiopia, and Dominican Republic, to name a few. So I decided to take the same survey to see if Anna and I are living below the poverty line. And turns out we are. So how's that possible? So this is the report that we're
40% richer than the average Canadian. If you live in Canada, you have no doubt been exposed to a certain sentiment.
About 40% of recent arrivals in the country say they are considering leaving their province or maybe Canada altogether.
The idea that Canada is going downhill
Now finds that almost 25% of Canadians are living in poverty.
and people are leaving Canada, and the politics in Canada is unbearable for many.
Thieves busting down doors, steal car keys.
And that immigration is destroying the country.
Edmonton's population has increased by more than 100,000 people in 2 years, and they're looking for a place to live.
You're bringing your problems from everywhere else in the world, you're bringing them to Ontario, unacceptable.
An OECD economic policy paper shows that Canada will outperform most, if not all, developed nations economically until 2060. And I've watched a lot of these videos. And a lot of these videos focus on the problems and the consequences of whether it's excessive immigration or economic mismanagement. I am going to dive into the actual causes. And only by looking into these causes can we determine if there is any hope for Canada or if Canada is well and truly. And if you are watching from another Western developed country, you might be able to relate. A lot of these problems I'm going to discuss are not unique to Canada, whether it's excessive immigration or excessive housing prices or economic mismanagement and stagnation. In this video, I'm going to look at specifically 4 sections, and that's going to be immigration, housing, productivity, and leadership. And all of these topics will be interconnected, so take this demarcation of topics with a grain of salt. And of course, first, the top.
GA's International was founded in 1999 by Dr. George Ambartsoumian.
Fuck up.
And I think a lot of people.
Shut the fuck up.
The topic that everyone has on their minds and everyone
Just where this gate's here is 10 Downing Street.
Everyone wants to talk about immigration. First, let's remind ourselves why immigration is important. If you're not familiar with the concept of
Canada
total
is made up of
fertility rate,
immigrants.
TFR, it's the idea
The only
that
people that have
every woman
fucking the right to
over
have this
the
fucking
course of her
debate are the
lifetime
fucking
has
native
to
people.
have at least
You guys are making us all look fucking
children
ridiculously
to keep the
stupid.
population stable. Canada's TFR currently is well below this number. It is at around 1.4. Now, this actually compares very favorably with some of the other countries that are on the extreme end of the total fertility rate collapse spectrum, such as South Korea, which is currently sitting at 0.8 children per woman,
Good.
and Japan, which is sitting at around 1.
Don't need more of your fucking
Now,
children.
we don't really need to rely on theory
Keep your
to
fucking legs
figure out
closed.
what happens when a population ages and even declines significantly. We only need to look at
We do
populations
not need
such
more
as,
of
for
your
example,
stupid
Japan,
fucking children.
which is a very interesting case study because not only has it had very low total
I
fertility
guess you're a good
rate for a
Christian.
sustained period of time, but it also does not have mass immigration. And what we observed is decades of stagnation in wages, productivity, and
Yeah, we
an
skipped the
aging
recession,
population
though.
with rising debt load.
Because we're just that
And when I say
good.
a rising debt load, I'm talking about debt on a national level. In fact, Japan can be found at the very top of countries with the highest debt to GDP ratios, along with weird candidates such as Venezuela in second place and Sudan in third place.
Sounds about
And
right.
it's not only just the economy,
Maduro
and
diet.
inflation, and all these factors. We also need a good supply of young workers.
But at
to
least he gave everyone a bunny rabbit. You can do what you want with it.
A lot
You
of
can
people
eat it,
don't
you can
really
breed it, you
understand
can make it
just
a
how
pet.
precarious the pension system in a country can be without
What a hero.
supply of fresh young labor.
What?
The contributions of the younger workers are used to pay off the retirements of the older population. So it's very important to have an acceptable ratio of older workers to older pensioners. The second thing, and this is not really why it's important to society as a whole, but why it's important to the government, what you have to realize is that the government loves immigration. Immigration provides a
And then
very
they can blame it
short-term
on all
boost
the immigrants.
to
Everything that's
GDP.
bad is
The total
apparently
GDP,
all the immigrants'
not
fault.
necessarily the GDP per
Like,
capita.
you guys are the ones who
If you
fucking
bring
told
in
them to come
hundreds of
here.
thousands, if not a million people into your country, they end up buying groceries, some of them might buy cars,
And
a
they
lot
do
of them
better
end up
business.
renting homes or even purchasing homes, and this results in higher
And then
aggregate
they're like,
demand,
they're stealing
which
all our
boosts the
jobs.
GDP.
I'm
The last thing the
bored. You
government,
guys just suck at
and
life.
specifically the incumbent administration, wants to see is the R word plastered on all the headlines. No government wants a recession on their watch.
No,
The
we
countries
skipped it.
also really love immigration. Not only does it legitimately let a lot of the roles that they need, but it also provides them with a bountiful supply of cheap labor, especially international students who cannot work full-time and will
And then they don't have to pay the
oftentimes work
benefits.
a lot
And
of
then we
part-time
never get jobs
and
again.
low-wage
Like,
jobs. And finally, schools. Schools absolutely love immigration because international students provide them with that sweet, sweet tuition money. If immigration is so essential, why is it a problem here in Canada? Firstly, I want to say it shouldn't be heretical to criticize immigration. I have to make a distinction here. Immigration is a policy. Immigrants are people.
Yeah.
So criticizing
You can't move them
immigration
like they're cattle.
is perfectly
Like-
valid and should not have any racial undertones attached to it. Criticizing
But
a
there
policy
is.
should be perfectly valid, just as it is to criticize any other policy.
We are changing a conversation that in Canada has never been where it is now. Where
Are you retarded?
historically we have been a country that has been
We
built
are
on immigrants,
regressing.
and now our taste for immigration is starting to cool a little bit because everybody's worried about where they're going to live.
Furthermore, I want to clarify that when you criticize
smells
immigration, it's not necessarily a matter of yes or no. It's not a switch. What should be debated
like really
is
shitty
the quantity and quality of immigration that Canada currently needs. For perspective, Canada admitted roughly 500,000 new immigrants compared to the United States 1 million. Despite the US having a population over 8 times as large. This 500,000 number doesn't include temporary foreign workers or international students, which puts pressure on rents and exacerbates the housing shortage. Altogether, Canada brings in an astounding million people into the country every year. And assuming 30% of the international students stay, and assuming 100% of the immigrants stay, that is like adding the entire city of Kitchener to the country every year. Or, for my American viewers, that is like adding the entire population of Vermont every year to Canada. I also want to talk about immigrant equality, which also goes hand in hand with this idea of integrating immigrants into the economy. So, excessive immigration and poor integration can have profound negative consequences for an economy. And this is playing out in Canada, but not in the way you might necessarily think. It is not a South Park style they took our jobs situation. Allow me to explain. So as I mentioned, corporations love immigrants. It provides them with a plentiful supply of cheap labor. And when you have 200 applicants for one minimum wage job, that allows them to experience a lower turnover rate. When you have 200 people who will easily take your place in a job, you are probably not going to quit that job. You're probably going to stay there for longer, and having a lower turnover rate is immensely beneficial for any company. Furthermore, when you do have a bountiful supply of cheap labor, what you can do as a company is not really invest a lot per worker. You don't really have an incentive as a company to go in and squeeze out every ounce of productivity from a worker. You could just hire more because there's just so many of them. And in fact, this is one of the biggest problems we see in Canada today.
Essentially, we're using the graduate student program as a source for cheap, exploitable, expendable, temporary labor.
We need more healthcare workers, tech innovators, and construction workers. What we do not need are more Uber drivers and Tim Hortons employees. Between 2002 and 2021, Canada's business investment per worker grew from $11,800 to $14,600, while in the United States, over the same period, investment per worker grew from $15,600 to $26,751. And this is one of the primary reasons why we can Canada falling behind the United States, as well as other developed nations. Now, I'm going to touch on productivity more in a bit, but let's talk about the next topic that everyone in Canada can't stop talking about, and that is housing. Now, as I mentioned earlier, excessive immigration puts upward pressure on rents, which also puts upward pressure consequently on the value of homes, as the value of any asset is directly proportional to the returns it can generate. This is further exacerbated by corruption and a very poor regulatory environment where it can take literally almost a decade from application to actually having homes online.
The staggering length of time it takes between when a purpose-built rental is proposed and then it actually being like ready to move into. Isn't Toronto one of the slowest cities in the world for getting it done?
Yeah, it's I think it's 100 months between development application submission and actually having the project completed.
And of course, this is not something that's going to help with the supply issues. The problem is compounded further by special interest groups and particularly NIMBYism. Overly restrictive zoning laws do not help. And these zoning laws are oftentimes backed by a lot of residents in a certain area. The lack of higher density homes is one of the biggest issues that Canada faces. Now, this means that governments can only generate a small amount of revenue per unit area, given the low density, but also a lot of small businesses that operate locally can only serve fewer number of customers per area and consequently generate a smaller revenue per unit area, which further lowers investment into both the business and the employees. I want to show you the real world impact of density. Paris has a population of 2.1 people over an area of 100 square kilometers, while Toronto has a population of 2.9 million people over 630 square kilometers. Toronto and Paris have population densities of 4,400 per kilometer squared and 20,000 per kilometer squared, respectively. And this is what the Paris subway looks like. And the Toronto subway system, you ready? Here it is. That's what it looks like.
Wow.
Without density, the ability of a city to support infrastructure and businesses becomes extremely limited. So homeowners want the status quo since their wealth is dependent on housing. The government needs to maintain the status quo as it generates substantial tax revenues and does not want to rock the boat and do anything that might reduce prices and thereby reduce tax revenues. And developers need home prices to continue to increase in order to justify building more and more homes. And finally, I want to talk about how rising housing prices destroy private investment, which brings me to the issue of productivity. The only way a country can really get richer is through increasing productivity, and that is productivity per worker. And the other way it's measured is the GDP for every hour worked. There is another concept of total factor productivity, which talks about the excess in productivity you get from the synergy between productivity of labor and productivity of capital, but I want to leave that aside for now and just focus on labor. Think of it as if you have a job where you make $30 an hour and you want to increase your overall earnings. Well, you have the option of working more hours, which will very likely lead to a lower quality of life because you're working more, or you could just increase the amount you make per hour. So the number of hours you spend working stays the same, but you just make a higher total amount of income. And that is what improves both your quality of life and your wealth. Productivity has diverged significantly between Canada and the United States. And this has been happening since 2001. And we have to ask ourselves, why is this happening? And first reason is Canada is simply overregulated. There's no way around it. The regulations in certain industries makes absolute sense. The banking sector, for example, needs to be highly regulated, and we saw what happens when it's not very well regulated in the United States in the 2008 financial crisis. And if you look at Canada, Canadian banks emerged relatively unscathed from that event. But in a lot of other industries, regulation can stifle innovation and even kill competition. In Canada, grocers, telecoms, and media companies face very little competition and are highly regulated, and really have very little incentive to innovate or compete. The other problem is the lack of a well-developed technology sector. The tech sector is responsible for a lot of jobs that are very highly paid. And if you look at the United States, that is the epicenter of tech right now. And Canada really doesn't have anything that can compare. A globally competitive tech sector barely exists in Canada, despite having a population that is very highly educated and a population that's very well connected. Next, Canada ranks behind most developed countries on the ease of doing business rankings, even behind Thailand and the Mauritius, and a whole 17 spots behind the United States. So within the context of a highly regulated economy, where you can get leveraged returns on real estate, and in a country with a booming population and a tight rental market, where do you think people are really going to put their money? Why would anyone invest in a business when they can make reliable returns on real estate? Granted, the real estate play is a bit more tenuous right now, given higher interest rates, but for the better part of the last 2 decades, real estate has been a proven winner. And once you have escalating home prices, what happens is more capital flows into the real estate sector instead of investing in businesses and machinery and training and people. And remember, the government loves housing because, as I said, they can get a substantial amount of revenue from real estate taxes and taxes on transaction fees, as well as land transfer taxes. I'm going to tell you a personal story, and I think it perfectly encapsulates everything that's wrong with Canada. So my parents are both doctors, and they've been working for over 2 decades in the Middle East. And when they were planning on coming to Canada, they got preferential treatment when it comes to the point system because they were doctors, they were professionals. However, when they came to Canada, they realized that they pretty much have to start from scratch in order to practice. Now, my parents are retired right now, but my dad was a pediatrician and my mom was an obstetrician. And they weren't even really looking to practice in these specialties in Canada. They were perfectly happy just having a job in the medical field, and they weren't really looking for that $200,000 to $300,000 a year that these specialties earn. However, the regulations and the paperwork and the amount of studying required was so insurmountable that my parents simply waited for 4 years, during which time they really tried to get their licensing and whatnot. And finally, when my parents received their Canadian citizenship, they realized that they could earn way more money working in the Middle East because they were now Canadian. Simply, the status change from not being Canadian to becoming Canadian increased their income 3 or 4-fold. And so they made the logical choice. They went back to and continued working there until they retired. And once they retired, they had a substantial nest egg that they brought into Canada to invest. And where do you think they invested it? Of course, it was housing. And I think this perfectly represents what is wrong with Canada today. Canada needs doctors. It brings in some doctors and is unable to economically integrate these individuals. It is not able to create wealth that stays within the borders of the country. And when wealth does come into the country, it is directed into the extremely unproductive real estate sector, which leads to higher housing prices. So instead of having more doctors, you just have higher housing prices. And with that, we finally get to the last piece of the puzzle, and that is leadership. I'm aware that we have a federal government and a provincial government, and I am going to really focus on the federal government and the federal policies here. Trudeau is the man everyone loves to hate right now, but before
because he's a fucking dipshit.
For a lot of the
Or fucking George Bush.
certainly there's a lot of blame to be placed on his shoulders, let us first take a look at his biggest
Fucking
legislative
Doomsday.
achievements over his tenure from 2015
Oh,
to
please
present.
no, I don't want to
So
hear
now,
it.
in no particular order, his biggest achievements were legalization of cannabis,
No.
signing of the Kuzma trade deal, signing of the Paris Agreement on climate change, banning assault-style weapons after the Nova Scotia attacks,
Oh my God.
reforming the CPP, and the carbon tax. These are the highest-profile policies enacted, but let me know in the comments if I missed anything. What is interesting
These
about
are
all of
all
these policies is that not a single one of them
pathetic.
has had a perceived positive impact
Thank you.
on the everyday lives of regular Canadians. Rather, the CPP reform and the carbon tax have both had perceived negative impacts on everyday Canadians.
Yeah,
And the
Maxim
perceived
Bernier,
impact
guys,
we're
it's
talking
all
about
fraud.
how the public perceived these policies. Now, this is not to say that I disagree or agree with a lot of these policies, but more on that in a second. So let's work our way down the list and look at each of these policies. Legalizing cannabis. While I might agree with this
fucked it up
policy,
for me.
this is not something that was a big
I was supposed
issue
to open my
on
restaurant.
the minds of
I was supposed to have a
everyday
fucking
Canadians. Furthermore,
restaurant
Canada
where you
was very
educate
relaxed when
people.
it came to recreational cannabis use to begin with. So unless you were a certain type of individual, your life really did not change that much.
I got Molly, I got Sister Sandra, I got Big Frank, I got birth control, I got Plan B, I got that morphine from China they took off the market, shit to make you dick hard, shit to make you dick
The Kuzma trade deal, also known as the USMCA trade deal.
As
Now,
it
this
turns
is
out,
basically
yep.
Trump's administration coercing Mexico and Canada into this deal.
Yep.
And Mexico and the United States actually had reached an agreement, and really they put a gun to Canada's head. And
Why
had
do you
them
think they're
sign
so
this
mad about the
agreement.
trucker protest? Not because people are protesting.
Completely. And this is the photo from the stage when
'Cause
she
they-
found out. And after this meeting, she was simply told you have 8 days to accept the original term. 7 days later, Justin Trudeau signed, and we got NAFTA too.
Canada did not really have a lot of bargaining power when it
They're
came to
blocking
this
the
issue, and
Chicago
because it's a
border.
far smaller economy than
What's
the
in
United
Chicago?
States, it got tossed around and had no
Could
choice
it be
but to
car
sign the
manufacturing
Signing
for all the
Paris
electric
Agreement
cars
on
that
climate
Trudeau
change.
promised
While
everybody
all
that
for
don't
helping
fucking
the
work?
environment and mitigating the impacts of climate change, this is not something that made a huge difference to the lives of everyday Canadians. Banning assault-style weapons after the Nova Scotia attacks. Now, I was actually surprised when I read about this because I wasn't even aware that you could purchase assault-style weapons in Canada.
Yeah.
And while I agree that this should never even have been allowed, and that's just my opinion, the passage of this law was more reactive and a reaction to a crisis rather than something proactive. Furthermore,
That's
the
the 3D
attack and its
printer. Kids
consequences
can
were
make one with
very
3D
tragic.
printers
The
now.
banning of assault weapons did not make a big difference to the broader Canadian population. Reforming the Canadian Pension Plan, the CPP.
And they blame
I
on
have to give
like
Trudeau
the
credit for this
Haitians.
one.
I'm like, they
It's
have
something that
machetes,
might be
not guns.
ostensibly or immediately
Oh.
unpopular, given that you get to keep less money.
Okay.
However, in the long run, the retirees do benefit from higher replacement of
Drink
their
some water,
income.
mister.
It goes up from 25% to 33%. Now, this was an uncharacteristically far-sighted legislation. And unlike
know, we need to go
Trudeau's
for a
other
walk, I know.
accomplishments,
Drink
this
some water
policy
first.
was one that is
Thank
not
you.
a short-term band-aid solution. And finally, the carbon tax. And boy, do I have a lot to say on this. Now, once again, this had a perceived negative impact on the finances of a lot of people. And while most of the people who pay this tax are going to get money back, and that's going to offset a lot that they pay in the taxes, the real issue is that people fill up their cars, whether it's once or twice or sometimes 3 times a month, whereas they only get the rebate once every quarter. So the pain of paying higher prices at the pump is felt more often than the joy of any carbon rebate checks. For those of you who say that this is responsible for inflation, there is a lot of misinformation out there, but the Bank of Canada has conducted a study and found that it is only responsible for 0.15% of the total inflation. However, my issue with the carbon tax is much more fundamental. Look, Canada has 0.5% of the world's population, and it has 2% of the world's GDP and produces 1.5% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions. I'm not denying that climate change is not an issue. And to be fair, there's lots of people out west who are living in areas that are ravaged by wildfires and dry conditions that are attributable to climate change. But most of the greenhouse gases are transboundary pollution. See, I'm all for tackling local pollution. That's, for example, a factory dumping toxic effluents into a nearby river, or contaminating the groundwater supply, or, for example, destroying the habitats of local wildlife.
You
These
mean
are
like those
negative
seaway that you guys
externalities
have been
that
dumping
need to be
fucking
taxed.
your
However, realize
shipping
that the
your
amount of
fucking your
greenhouse gases that Canada generates
what do you call
is
them?
negligible and a rounding error relative to the total greenhouse gas emissions, particularly the greenhouse gas emissions that are
You
generated
shipped all
by
your
the
Amazon
biggest
fucking
economies.
packages on
Here's
it.
something
I've
you'd
been
be
dumping
interested
into the seaway for like
95%
years.
of the
Like
total
6 years of
new
the natives
coal
saying this
power
and then
generated
like
in
saying no,
2023
no he
was
didn't, and then
in
like
China.
so these are satellite images.
You know, the United
Where
States,
there's that black
just south
spot
of the
that
border,
you can go
guess
back,
what?
but used
They
to not be
are
a black
the biggest
spot.
producer
Like,
of
they're like,
crude oil.
oh well, I
Quite
guess we
the
are.
largest
Sorry.
No, it's
Here's
not
like $2
Russia or
million.
Saudi Arabia. It's the good old United
Like that's not the
States.
point.
So I look at this carbon tax mostly as a self-flagellation on a national scale. And this martyrdom and signaling to the world that we are doing something and we're somehow more virtuous, it is not helping regular Canadians. I want to stress, I think we should deal with climate change. But Canada is a small country of 40 million people. It's not going to make a big difference. It's kind of like drinking from a paper straw, thinking that you're doing your part to save the environment, while Kim Kardashian flies on her private jet 5 times in one day simply to, I don't know, grab burgers or something from another city. Now I'm going to touch on 2 more factors we need to consider, and they're not necessarily policy. The first is inflation, and the second is the government's COVID response. On inflation, I do not think we can really blame Trudeau for causing it. So if you look around the world, we have had inflation in Asia, in Europe, in frickin' Japan that had decades of stagnation and even deflation. And we've seen inflation occur in both countries that have right-wing governments in place and countries that have left-wing governments in place. So inflation has been a global phenomenon. What we need to understand is how Canada dealt with inflation. The reasons for inflation are complex. The hangover of supply chain issues from COVID and compounded by the war in Ukraine, along with what was in 2022 and 2023, a very low level of unemployment. So while Canada did experience lower inflation when you compare it to the inflation that was experienced by the United States, I cannot really judge that to be a success or a failure. It's challenging to give a verdict on whether Canada did well on inflation or not. It experienced lower inflation than the United States, but we do not have any point of reference for what is an appropriate amount of inflation within the context of supply chain issues caused by a pandemic, compounded by a war causing major disruption in food production. And next, I want to touch on COVID management. There's a couple of things. I'm not going to get into the philosophical debate on whether the curtailment of freedoms was appropriate or not. This
Oh fuck no. Go away.
And do let me know in the comments about what you think. I am going to judge Trudeau's performance on COVID policy primarily using 2 metrics. How much did Canada spend as a percentage of its GDP on COVID relief? And how many deaths attributable to COVID did Canada experience per 1 million people? When it comes to spending, the data shows that Canada spent more than a lot of other developed countries. However, Canada did spend less than the United States. And certainly we have to consider that there was a monumental waste of taxpayer money. I'm sure you've seen the news of the ArriveCan app scandal, as well as sending out COVID benefits to a lot of people who did not really qualify for them, and a lot of people who actively scammed the system to receive these benefits. However, the mortality rate attributable to COVID in Canada was very low. The United States was in 17th place with 3,500 deaths per million, and Canada was far lower in 88th place with 1,400 deaths per million. And what's interesting is out of the countries spending less than 5% of GDP, Canada did better than all countries except South Korea, Sweden, and Turkey. So by the metrics of spending and mortality, one could reasonably judge Canada to have navigated COVID fairly successfully. And whenever we look at anything very broadly, I know it tends to diminish the personal stories and the personal impact that COVID had on a lot of people. And I don't mean to invalidate that. And perhaps there are other metrics that can be taken into account to have a more fulsome picture of the impact on COVID. So do let me know what other metrics we should use to judge COVID policy success or failure. So where does all of this leave us? What I can see after taking into account all this information is that Canada is hopelessly addicted to short-term reactionary measures that are primarily regulatory. So if you have high rents, implement stricter rent controls. Rent controls are creating vacant homes, have a vacant home tax. Foreigners buying up too many homes, put in a foreign buyer's tax. Don't like high grocery prices, have a grocery code of conduct. Don't like having too many poor people, increase taxes. Global warming, put in a carbon tax. Too many international students, let's put an international student cap. And while Trudeau is not responsible for all of these policies that I just mentioned, it does show a willingness by the Canadian population at large to be overregulated. There has been no substantial policy to build more homes, to improve competition and lower grocery prices, lower protectionism and increase efficiency of food producers, and improve the economy so as to alleviate poverty. Let's not forget the doctor shortage, for which I haven't even seen any action being taken by any party, whether the ones in power or whether the ones that are hoping to get into power. Trudeau's tenure, in my opinion, can be characterized most generously as malignantly lazy. And least charitably, I would say it is aggressively incompetent. Based on his policy focus, it seems like Trudeau is a man who really wants to be liked by other world leaders and wants to raise his international profile. Policies that were likely to receive more global media attention were prioritized over more domestic concerns. I'm astounded by the fact that the government did not anticipate that having no cap on international students would make small fly-by-night, no-name colleges exploit international student enrollment and basically become diploma mills just to make a buck. And when it comes to housing, I understand that COVID may have distorted the housing markets with very low interest rates in 2020 and part of 2021, and then subsequently very high interest rates for the couple of years after to present day. But housing was a problem in 2014 and 2015 and 16 and 2017. And yet only now, with Trudeau facing an election on the horizon and with very concerning poll numbers, it seems like he's trying to take action, finally. But even that action that he's taking right now is not radical or substantial. And I totally get that housing falls under the provincial leadership's purview, but it seems really irresponsible to me that the federal government sets immigration policy and immigration targets and does not really coordinate with local governments to understand how much the local communities and cities and provinces, how much immigration they can absorb. Where do we go from here? Look, it's easy for me to stand here and talk about different solutions we can consider. I'm not a genius. I'm sure I'm not the first person to talk about these things. Furthermore, government is complex. There's an interplay of different stakeholders and different power brokers, and compromises have to be made, and I understand that. But with that in mind, let's talk about some common sense actions that the government could take. To start, the government could look into linking immigration and international student enrollment to housing availability. And this is going to require more coordination between provincial and federal governments instead of just one party passing the buck to the other. Next, we could consider increasing density and easing zoning laws. Look, Canada has very strict zoning laws and very slow, cumbersome permitting process. There are other countries that are liberal, market-oriented economies and that have democratic societies that do very well with much more lax zoning laws. So why can we not consider them? We need to build more and faster, not just as a tagline, but actually do it. Shortening the time from applying to permit to actually getting the homes available is going to be huge. We also need to understand the fundamental incentive structure that governments have. They are only looking to win the next election. So they're only going to put in place short-term band-aid solutions and not really the more longer-term solutions that are going to benefit society much more, but that they cannot take credit for. With concerted effort, housing will take 20 or so years to fix. The productivity problem is more of a 10 to 15-year process to fix. Regulations might take 5 to 10 years, and finally immigration reform that can happen immediately. It looks like Trudeau's days are numbered. He may be able to pull off a victory, I don't know, but it's not looking very good. Let me tell you that Poilievre is not going to be the savior. He's not going to be the panacea that Canada needs. Here's the thing. Canada does not have a party that advocates for laissez-faire market economics. Now, I'm not saying that market outcomes are always socially or even financially or economically optimal. But in the States, if you talk about entitlements and if you talk about regulations, there are voices that will immediately cry out socialism and authoritarianism. And while that may be unreasonable, we do need an unreasonable extreme to swing the pendulum back into the center. And frankly, Canada does not have that tempering force within our government. The public is very willing to be regulated. And it doesn't help that individuals, broadly speaking, are notoriously inept at making short-term sacrifices for long-term benefits, which only incentivizes the government to really reflect their will and come up with short-term fixes, primarily driven by regulation. People only see as far as their next paycheck. Businesses only see as far as their next shareholder meeting, and governments only as far as the next election. And I don't want to sound dramatic, but it really comes down to the individuals. If people vote, for example, against higher density, you are voting for the long-term decline of the Canadian economy and society. If you vote for rent controls, you are similarly voting for a long-term decline in housing affordability. And the government loves to do this. They love to pit landlords against tenants. Instead, tenants and landlords should get together and try to vote governments that actually build more supply. No government wants to tackle the supply problem because they're not going to get credit for it. And instead, they come up with sugary treats like zoning laws and rent controls, which are very satisfying in the short run, but provide no long-term benefit. And we are all, government and people alike, simply kicking the can down the road. So there you have it. I'm not sure who's going to win the next election, but sadly, I do not think it matters. Poilievre has not really come up with any coherent or even daring or interesting policies. He is going to be just another leader who is beholden to special interest groups, and given the incentive structure in place, he is going to do what all other governments do, which is to make short-term and short-sighted decisions that get a lot of play in the media. So get ready for half a century of decline coming to a city or a province near you. Unless you're rich, in which... Alright folks, there you have it. Let me know what you think. This is a very complex topic with lots of moving parts.
This is a very complicated case, Mod. You know, a lot of ins, a lot of outs, a lot of what have you.
So there's no way I could have covered every facet of the issues. I am certain I missed a bunch of things. Let me know in the comments what I missed. Let me know if you think I'm incorrect on anything. And I really am looking forward to dissenting opinions. My hope is that this video gets everyone thinking, and if you were able to disagree with me in a respectful way and we're able to have a dialogue, then I think Discussions like that really help individuals become more well-informed and responsible citizens. So thank you very much. Like and subscribe if you haven't. Have a great day.
What were you just teaching me about mouth breathing and how it changes the shape of the face?
So I arrived carrying a copy of the book Jaws, A Hidden Epidemic. This is not Jaws the shark. This book was written by my colleagues at Stanford, Sandra Kahn and Paul Ehrlich, and it has an introduction by Jared Diamond, who won a Pulitzer for Guns, Germs, and Steel, and a foreword by the great Robert Sapolsky, also a colleague of mine at Stanford. So 4 heavy hitters on this book, just to credential it first. This book centers around a couple of core concepts, but the first being that people, and in particular children, who overuse mouth breathing as opposed to nasal breathing, have changes in the structure of the face that, well, to be quite direct, makes them far more unattractive than if they were to mouth breathe. It also discusses the chewing of foods as essential to mouth and face development. Sandra Kahn is an expert in craniofacial function and structure. And the fact that if your parents and you did things right, you should be able to place your entire tongue on the roof of your mouth with your mouth closed. Now, I can't do that. Okay, so when your teeth closed, tongue on the roof of your mouth, I can, but I still feel the back of my teeth a bit. Yeah. Okay. So that's the second point, that we want to chew hard. Chewing foods is essential to tooth and mouth and face development. These days, many children slurp their food. Many adults slurp their foods. Many adults are eating like babies. And of course, babies, before they develop their mature teeth, and even before they get all of their teeth,
Are you trying to call me? Oh, good. More fucking juice shit.
Want to say that I will not tell the person's name simply because Shauna Parker and Felix Papineau, after everything that has happened, they are in the same litigation that we are involved in as employees of the organization by this particular individual.
Sir, just so you're aware, it's not your choice whether or not to answer the question. So you must answer the question fully and truthfully.
Mr. Barrett,
you are
truthful,
or not answering the question, you are not doing, is a contempt of this committee. And there are consequences for contempt. So you have an opportunity today to clear the air and to say who the other Randy is. But the reason you're not saying it is because it's Randy Boissonneau. Is that?
Want to say that I will not.
Again, what I was doing was moving in my son to a new apartment in Florida, and then of course, about 6 days from now, we'll be in the mountains, the Blue Ridge Mountains, for a retreat. So I'm like, everything is really packed into this one little 6-day bubble of trying to get everything done. And it's raining.
Oh, that's nice. Yeah. I'm feeling the same way. Like the month of July, I was thinking was going to shape up to be kind of a calm month, but then we went on vacation and had the accident with the deer and blah blah blah, and then we come back to a hurricane, and it's a week cleaning up after a hurricane, and then I had a guest here this week. We had a great time, but you know, it's like squeezing that in with making sure he's being attended to while I'm taking care of everything else, and trying to recover from some aspects of the hurricane where I couldn't do any work, and then next week's the retreat and changing everything around for that. And I come back from that, and I've got guys coming in for my birthday, you know, coming in for the weekend to kind of celebrate my birthday. So it's turned out to be really.
That's a lot of fun stuff. So you'll get.
It is. It's been fun. It's been a lot of connection, which is great, and I'm really looking forward to the retreat and stuff. But yeah, it's a lot. I'm gonna be.
We got something else to celebrate. Thanks for everybody who's tuning in on YouTube. We passed 1,000 subscribers this week with a bullet. I mean, we went from about 850 to 1150 in a week, and it was crazy, man, to see that. So thanks for everybody who's given us tons of feedback and comments on posts. We've actually gotten a few more questions via email. We're going to cover some of those in just a second. So if you've got questions for this live, I encourage you to post that in the chat and say hello to us, and let's connect. And we're also going to do something cool next week at the retreat. So our live next week, and we'll try to put this up on social media and everything to get you communicated about this. Our next live will not be at Friday at 11 Central. It's actually going to be Thursday at 8 p.m. Central. So Thursday, 8 p.m. Central, and it's going to be live from the retreat. So we're going to be there with all the guys that are at the retreat, taking questions, discussing things. It's going to be really, really interactive. So if you want to see a live that's a lot more like a group and not just Scott and I, you know, picking our noses on YouTube, that's right. So tune in for that. You can always catch the replay, but tune in for that next week at 8 Thursday. What is that? The 25th? Is that right? I think Thursday the 25th, 8 p.m. Central, 9 p.m. Eastern.
Let me out, I'm stuck in your pocket.
That is correct, the 25th.
Yeah, so that is Thursday the 25th. So just 1 week only. We're going to do a change in our live time. So catch us then, and you really will be able to interact with us and a bunch of the guys. We got 18 guys going to be at the retreat, doing story work, getting connected around what it means to truly be emotionally aware. And more importantly than that, to just have an experience of safety and kindness and curiosity together. And those are kind of our hallmarks.
Hey, I got a question for you. Are we going to be able to ever do live, like phone calls, take phone calls from dudes, or what's the deal?
Yeah, that'd be a great question. I don't know. Good question. So right now, we're stuck with the chat. So we'll work on it. We'll see what we can do. It's going to turn into a radio chat show like Love Line with Dr. Drew.
John Delaney's show. I had a friend that actually called into John Delaney's with a sexual fantasy question this week. So that's
all we got to do is have a Google number that people can call into. We might work on that. See how
that's probably a good idea. But you know what surprised me this week too is we put out our bro baiting episode, and it's exploded. I knew it would be popular, but
I'd never even heard of bro baiting before. You're like, hey, we got to do an episode on this. I mean, I thought about the concept, but I've never heard.
Yeah. And so, man, it skyrocketed up in 2 days, and we've gotten a lot of feedback from guys on it and stuff. And so I'm not surprised, but I guess I was surprised at how quickly it took off. And I think it'll probably be one of our most popular episodes so far.
Let me out, I'm stuck in your pocket.
Catalog. So
let me out, I'm stuck in your pocket.
A lot of good questions were raised and a lot of issues brought up by that with guys, and very similar to what we talked about, like guys in their 40s kind of being invited into this space of sexting or masturbating together on camera, stuff like that, where they've never done that before, and yet it seems to be a really interesting kind of prevalent dynamic that are out there, that's out there. I think, which is, what do you think is going on there? I'm just curious about like fleshing that out a little bit more. What are the dynamics that are going into that?
Oh man, I think we're in a crisis of masculinity. I think that's and we're grasping at straws. I think the porn culture is really one of those things that it's been it's going on for what 35, 40 years, porn culture. And so it's like we're trying to. So now, how do we get to this level of connecting and intimacy and vulnerability and even questions that we've had recently being exposed sexually and being naked with other people, and we're longing to be seen and to be aroused. And probating, I mean, that's a perfect combination of those two things, right?
Yeah. And I'll say too, I think there's an epidemic of loneliness among men in this country, particularly centered in that 40 to 50-year-old time period. The research has indicated the number one cohort that commits suicide is men in their 40s and 50s. Did you know that?
I did know that, yeah, unfortunately.
So there's a tremendous epidemic of loneliness and isolation, I think. And I think the mistake, like, men need a tribe, Chris. I think men need to be.
All right, so hold on. You're saying that men need other men to be what? To be productive, to excel? Do we need a team to win? What are you talking about? We need a tribe.
We need a tribe to feel like we're men. We are pack creatures. And I don't know, I was just a couple days ago, I've got a beautiful 15-year-old granddaughter. And the 15-year-old boys like to go by here and hope to catch her sunbathing. Yeah. And they come by in packs, like 5, 6, 10 guys riding their bikes, young guys and adolescent men. And I remember those days. And I think there's a longing, when you're growing up in adolescence, you're kind of hanging out with guys and you're playing team sports. It's guys doing stuff together. And of course, as we talked about in the podcast, that's when a lot of guys do actually experiment with masturbating in a group setting, like circle jerks and stuff like that. But
yeah, but it's interesting, and we talked about this as well, that's like something you kind of fall into or it just happens, right? And again, I after listening to the episode, I want to make sure that we say this. It isn't good or bad. It just happens, right? So we're not promoting it. We're not shaming it. We're just saying this is something that happens. What we're talking about and going to get to the root of is how do we reconnect with that experience later in life?
Yeah. And so, one of the things that Gabor Mate talks about in his compassionate inquiry approach, which is when you're dealing with behaviors that, there's a part of that behavior that is really enlivening to you and it makes you feel alive. And then there's a part of it that you feel has the potential to really unravel you and really disintegrate you. And I think this is one of those things, but all of our sexual behavior kind of carries that double-edged sword aspect to it. It brings us alive, but it also could bring us a lot of harm. So what he says in that is, if you're going to engage in something, at least do it intentionally instead of automatically not thinking about it. And I think there's a lot of wisdom in that, right? Like, so we're not necessarily endorsing or shaming either thing, but we're going to say, if you're doing this, maybe be curious about what's the intention behind it, so that if you're going to engage in it, you know why you're doing it instead of just doing it automatically. And I think that's the problem, is guys do stuff like this automatically and they're not thinking about it, and then they feel a lot of shame afterwards, so it reinforces their shame.
Well, and I would say this, I credit a friend of mine, Roan Hunter, who pointed this out. I'm not sure where he got it. He may have got it from Richard Rohr or some other people, but one of the key aspects of being a man is that idea of being intentional, is men take action. And so when you're talking about the intentionality, really you're getting back to that heartbeat of why are so many men attracted to this? Because there was a happenstance of this at some point, or that you just kind of fell backwards into this. Like every exposure to something new is, very few people actually seek out something new just because they're curious. Most people are just it just happens to them. And then there's a feeling in the body that goes, oh shit, this is real. And then you begin to get to that question like the War Mateo was talking about. Why are you doing this? And the question we ask guys, what do you really want? What's really going on in your desires?
And I go back to this idea of tribalism, that men long for a tribe. They long to belong, right? And it's, I want to be a part of a team. I want to be a part of a tribe. I want to be on a mission, but I don't want to do that by myself. I want to do it with other men. I want to know there are other guys
in a tribe, right? They're more protected.
It's safer, but I also receive the attaboys and the slap on the butt or the shoulders, and it's like it encourages me. It gives me that support to take those risks. And so I think that's a lot of the underlying, when we get to the question of what are you really looking for? I want to be a part of a tribe where my masculinity is affirmed, it's recognized, it's honored, and it's kind of celebrated. And this is a way to get at that when guys aren't intentional about knowing that that's what I really long for in my life. So I want to name that because I think it's a really fundamental, beautiful, good desire to belong, to want to have a tribe around me and to have that kind of fellowship and brotherhood. And
so Copper just chimed in and said, my want was to be in honest community. What do you think about that? Honest community. That was a deep desire of his.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I want to, so it's what you're talking about. I want to be seen.
Yeah.
So I don't want this pretense, like I got to pretend to be accepted, or I've got to kind of man up is the word, right?
But that's different than, I mean, because how can I man up when I can't truly be myself? Like there's this division, this split, right? There's this, I'm trying to be the real me. And that's why maybe this getting naked together or, mutual masturbation thing is you're kind of exposed. Everybody's exposed. We're all on the same playing field. And yet as we sit there and we're being the real me, it's accepted. It belongs. There's a connection. It's almost like honesty is an environment more so than a behavior,
Yeah. And so when I hear that word honesty too, as it relates to either masturbating together or being naked together, I think the thing about that is we all tend to hold a lot of shame in our body. Particularly guys hold a lot of shame around their penis, or around their physique, or around their masculine attributes. And so that kind of activity together kind of allows for that sense of, well, this is me, this is who I am, and this is what my erect penis looks like, and what do you guys think? And it's a quest to have that being seen without any of that pretense there. And it reminds me of, I've never participated in the Mankind Project activities. I've done stuff with Brothers Road and Crucible Project, and they always ask you not to disclose what their psychodrama or their processes are, so it's a surprise. But I think probably enough people have heard about this stuff. In the Mankind Project, there's a process that they have done where guys are naked. So you'll have 100 guys at a weekend, and they'll all be standing in a circle naked, and they hold a mirror in front of a man and say, "What do you see?" And the guy mirrors back what he sees about his own body and his own masculinity to the group, and then all the men go around and they say, the beauty I see in you is this.
Yeah.
And it's a really transformative experience because you're doing that in the environment of being completely transparent with what your body looks like. And you realize in a group of 100 guys, there's different body types. Some guys are tall, some guys are short, some guys are fat, some guys are really lean, some guys are really muscular, some guys have big penises, some guys have small. We're all men. We're all men. And that sense of wanting to belong and fit in, I think that's what that's getting at, what he's talking about.
Yeah, but so there's two things. There's the acceptance, the honesty, the vulnerability, all that. But there's also, and it's so easy to blow right past it, it's the blessing.
Yes.
How many times do we as men speak positively about other men? And this is not like everybody, well, that's soft. That's like, dude, how are you going to find out what other people see in you unless you take the time? That's one of the things we're going to do at the retreat to kind of wrap it up, is to bless each man so that they can leave that space, not only having their hard, shameful pieces held and seen and cared for, but also they can build their identity. They can develop a little more about what they believe about themselves through the kindness of these other guys.
So I'll take it even a little further. We talk about attachment needs. Like, where does all of our misdirected sexual stuff come up? It's in the attachment wounds that occurred in development and our sexual development. And if you look at, there's an attachment modality that was developed by some really smart dudes, and I haven't taken the training yet, but I've watched some of their videos, and I really like the way they kind of crystallize it, that there are 5 attachment needs that we all have. And so you can apply this to male attachment needs, because men have needs with other men. You had a need with your father, and that need was either met or it wasn't met. So they boil it down like this, that we need to feel safe and protected, number 1. Number 2, we need attunement. We talk a lot about attunement here.
We do.
Number 3, we need to be soothed and comforted in our distress. Number 4, we need to hear expressed delight. Chris, I delight in you just because of who you are, not because of what you do, but because of the good that I see in you intrinsically. And the last thing we need is support and encouragement to go out and believe that we can bring beauty and goodness to the world, and that makes us take risks, but it also involves adventure and play. Those are the 5 needs. And if you look at, kind of group masturbation, it's meeting those needs in some sense.
Yeah.
Each of those. But you can meet them in a healthy male experience of bonding. Like, you can meet that. We do that in our groups where we engage guys when they're distressed emotionally, when they're struggling, and we give them those 5 attachment needs. And so when you talk about the blessing, that's that expressed delight. Here's the good I see in you.
Mm.
And it's so rare. It's so rare because for some reason we feel like it's weak for a man to need the affirmation or the praise of other men, or it's, if I tell you, man, you got great looking biceps, that's kind of gay, and maybe I'm hitting on you or whatever. But
yeah,
we need to outdo one another in honor, the Bible says. Like, what would that be to be in a relationship where just you're honored?
It would be heavenly, which is why we're probably not going to get to it this side of paradise, right? And that's our job. That's our role as people of faith, to try to be focused on the things that seem otherworldly, which is why rather than coming to these conversations that we do so without being prescriptive or giving advice, telling our story. We try to tell our stories and offer curiosity and kindness over and over and over again, because it seems so weird. Like, why are you talking about all these topics and not getting upset about them? Well, because it's part of the brokenness of the world, and we don't have what you're talking about, that prescriptive blessing, often enough. So why not expand the space to make that happen? So
yeah.
I mean, I think it's like the guy in the chat, Sean, says, I have a community of men where I feel fully known and loved, based on the last 4 years working vulnerably together. Even so, I still carry body shame. So this is a process, right? There's so much in this that we're still working on. We're never going to get to the place where we're completely dealt with. Everything's completely dealt with this side.
Yeah.
So anyway, so we did have an email this week from a guy, and he showed up on the line, wants to hear the response. So we're going to engage Brian's question. So Brian, thank you for writing in and giving us some great ideas. And your question was, what percentage of men of color do you work with? Some of the things we talk about, like men masturbating in the same room, I never heard of before. I'm curious if this is cultural. So I'll start, and Scott, let you chime in. Brian, I really would say we work with about the same percentage as the population. My clients are probably 15% 18% men of color. And so it just happens to be how it works out. Now, one of the things that I would say about this is that I can always find a way to feel different. You know, penis size, skin color, cultural background, levels of abuse, religious dynamics, anything else I'm leaving out that just seem obvious.
Yeah.
I can latch onto that one thing and be
orientation, like I'm
sexual
attracted to guys.
orientation. Yeah, sexual orientation. I can feel especially ashamed or othered. That's the word I like to use. Othered in that thing. And so every time that comes up, there's an insecurity, there's a embodied shame that just kind of rolls to the surface that becomes a defense mechanism. There was a guy that I was doing some work with that was talking about his sexual abuse as a child and made the comment that nobody else has been sexually abused like me in this group. And I was like, I don't know. We don't know every guy's story. Maybe not. Don't know. So when you hear that, what comes to your mind, Scott?
Yeah, my first question is, why is it important to you that you have the most intense and harmful abuse story? How does that help you to see yourself as having that? Because
or that your otherness disqualifies you for being in with other people. Yeah.
And I think that's a survival strategy, honestly, that's cropping up. It's a mechanism that helps me either kind of maintain a sense of victimology, like I'm a victim. So you don't know how I've suffered in my life, and this allows me to feel sorry for myself, which then allows me to kind of soothe myself in whatever way I feel is necessary to soothe myself, because I don't really have to take ownership for, if I'm a victim, I can't really help myself. So it's kind of a learned helplessness. I think you hear in that, like, this is what happened to me. I can't do anything about it, and woe is me. And so my heart is tender for a guy that's expressing that, because what he's never gotten is, I don't think he's gotten a lot of care in his story and received that attunement, and where he feels like others are connecting with the way he suffered. So part of the solution there is, I think, to actually receive attunement in telling your story and not feeling like your suffering is being minimized or dismissed or trivialized. And that's probably what's happened.
So
there.
let's talk about that for a second, because I've seen that happen over and over again. So somebody comes into a group, comes into a meeting, virtual or in person, doesn't matter. And they begin to tell their story, and they're wearing that defense mechanism, that victimhood, that otherness on themselves. And they're telling their story, and guys don't react to it. They don't go, oh, well, it's because you're, so-and-so, or because you had this experience. And instead, and Brian, I know you're stuck on the ethnic thing, but there's in every culture, there's things we don't talk about. But in these groups, what we get to talk about is we get to experience an acceptance that is human. I want to put a big exclamation point, underline, highlight on that. We're all looking to be seen in our humanity. And the softness of the group and the kindness and curiosity of the group begins to transform a man as he goes through that process. Unfortunately, I can't give you the magic pill to make that happen here. It's got to be a process you go through personally, engage in personally, right, Scott? I mean, have you been able to talk somebody into that in a coaching session or something?
No. And I was going to say, it goes back to this issue of otherness. Like, what are the things in my life that make me feel outside of masculinity, or outside of the mainstream, or outside of the way I'm supposed to be, right? And so if I grow up and my race has been used, or my skin color has been used against me, I mean, there is objective racism that's prevalent, in the culture, and there is objective homophobia, and there are all these experiences that we have, and so those all contribute to that way in which I tell myself, based on my experience, I am not good enough, or there's something wrong with me, or I don't belong. And so I think what we're trying to do in our groups is create a place where everybody is safe to bring all of that, every part of them, every part that they feel has been ostracized and isolated and made to feel other is welcome. And that's one of the reasons we don't do, for example, we don't do same-sex attracted only groups. There are organizations that do that, and that's fine. But my feeling is